Main engine dead, starting air gone, drifting in the Mississippi River. The telegraph on the bridge was ringing for full astern, but the propeller shaft was not turning. We were moving at 6 knots downstream, carried by the heavy brown current. The ship began to swing sideways. We were losing steerage because there was no water flow over the rudder. The river bend was coming up fast, and a line of parked barges was sitting right in our path. The bridge called down on the phone, shouting for revolutions, but the tachometer on the control console stayed at 0. The ship was dead weight in a moving river. Down below, the silence was terrifying. A moment before, we had tried to reverse the engine. The starting air lever was pushed, but the number 4 starting air valve on the cylinder head had jammed open. It did not close after the engine turned. Instead of firing, the compressed air, our lifeblood for maneuvering, vented straight through the cylinder and out the exhaust stack. It was a massive roar of wasted energy. Within 30 seconds, the main air bottles dropped from 30 bar to 6 bar. The pressure was too low to turn the engine. We had no way to restart. This happened in 1984 on a bulk carrier entering the Mississippi River near New Orleans. I was the 3rd engineer at the time. The ship was an old Sulzer 6-cylinder diesel, built in the late 60s. She was a heavy ship, fully loaded with grain. The river pilot was nervous even before we started because the current was unusually strong that spring. I was standing on the bottom plates near the maneuvering stand, logging the temperatures. The engine room was hot, about 45 degrees Celsius, and humid. The ventilation fans were roaring, but they just pushed hot air around. When the air pressure dropped, the chief engineer turned pale. He was a strict man, usually very calm, but I saw his hands shake as he gripped the control lever. He pushed it back and forth, hoping the valve would unstick. It did nothing. The needle on the air pressure gauge just kept falling. It hit 5 bar, then 4. The main compressors were running automatically. They made a rhythmic thump, thump, thump sound in the corner of the engine room. But they were small compressors. They needed 40 minutes to fill the air bottles. We did not have 40 minutes. We barely had 4 minutes before we hit the barges. I looked at the chief. He pointed up to the cylinder heads. He didn't have to say a word. I knew what I had to do. I had to go up to the top plates and isolate the jammed valve manually. Before I tell you what we found inside that cylinder, if you enjoy these true stories from the engine room, please subscribe. It helps me share more of this maritime history with you. I ran for the ladder. The metal railings were slippery with oil and sweat. My heavy steel-toed boots clanged hard on every step. It is a long climb from the control platform to the cylinder tops on a big Sulzer engine. The heat rises, so it gets hotter the higher you go. By the time I reached the top grading, the air was thick and hard to breathe. I could smell the exhaust fumes leaking slightly from the turbocharger manifold. I ran to cylinder number 4. I put my hand near the starting air pipe. It was scorching hot. This confirmed that hot combustion gas had blown back into the airline. The valve was definitely stuck open. I grabbed the heavy isolation valve wheel. It was a manual shutoff valve on the air supply line. It was painted red, but the paint was peeling from years of heat. I tried to turn it clockwise to cut off the air to that cylinder. It wouldn't move. It was seized tight. I gripped the rim of the wheel with both hands and pulled. My gloves slipped on the smooth metal. I wiped my hands on my boiler suit and tried again. I put my boot against the pipe for leverage and pulled with all my weight. The wheel groaned, metal grinding on metal, and finally turned half an inch. It seemed impossible that one rusted valve could doom the whole ship. But you won't believe how we had to get the air back into the system without the compressors. I spun the wheel until it seated. The flow of air to number 4 was cut. But the damage was already done. The main air bottles were effectively empty. The pressure gauge on the local board read 3 bar. You cannot start a main engine with 3 bar. You need at least 15 or 20 to get a good kick, especially when the propeller is fighting the river current. The telegraph rang again. Ding, ding, ding. They wanted emergency full astern. I looked over the rail down to the control platform. The chief engineer looked up at me. He made a cutting throat gesture. We were dead in the water. The compressors were still thumping away, far too slow to help us. The auxiliary generators were humming loudly, powering the lights and pumps, but they couldn't move the ship. The vibration of the deck changed. Usually, you feel the deep throb of the main piston. Now, there was only the high-pitched whine of the turbocharger spinning down to a stop. I stayed on the cylinder tops. I grabbed a flogging spanner from the shadow board. It was a heavy tool, solid steel, about 1 meter long. I knew we had to remove the starting valve to see why it stuck. Maybe we could clean it. Maybe we could free it. The nuts holding the valve cover were 30 Amors. They were rusted and baked on by the heat. I set the spanner on the first nut. I didn't have a hammer up there. I had to use my boot. I kicked the end of the spanner. The shock traveled up my leg, jarring my knee. The nut didn't move. I kicked it again harder. A flake of rust flew off and hit my safety goggles. The nut cracked loose with a screech. I moved to the next one. There were 4 nuts. I was sweating so much it was running into my eyes, stinging like acid. Below me, the phone from the bridge rang. It was a loud, old-fashioned bell. It rang and rang. Nobody answered it. The chief was too busy staring at the pressure gauges, praying for them to rise. They were not rising. The ship lurched. It wasn't a roll. It was a sudden deceleration. We had grazed something, maybe the soft mud of the bank, or maybe we had bumped a barge. Tools on the workbench below slid and fell to the floor plates. A bucket of rags tipped over. I got the last nut off. I lifted the heavy steel cover of the starting valve. A puff of black smoke came out. The spring inside was broken. The coil had snapped in 2 pieces. The valve spindle was jammed in the down position. I shouted down to the chief, "Broken spring, valve seized." He shouted back, his voice barely audible over the generators, "No, leave it, come down, we need to rig the emergency fill." I dropped the spanner. It hit the grating with a loud clang. I scrambled back down the ladder. My heart was pounding in my ears. The ship was tilting slightly to port now. We were definitely pushed up against the bank or an obstruction. The current was pinning us there. The chief was running toward the aft part of the engine room. He was heading for the emergency air compressor. This was a small diesel-driven compressor, usually used only when the ship is completely blacked out and has no power at all. But we had power. We just didn't have volume. "The main line is too slow," the chief yelled. "We have to bypass." The engine room felt smaller now. The walls seemed to be closing in. The river outside was silent and deadly, but inside it was a cage of noise and heat. We were drifting, stuck on the mud, with no way to back off. And the air pressure was still sitting at 3 bar. I looked at the main air receiver. It was a massive vertical tank, 2 stories high. It was empty. It takes a lot of air to fill that tank. The little emergency compressor was like trying to fill a swimming pool with a garden hose. The bridge telegraph rang again. "Stop." Then full astern again. The captain was panicking. He needed power now. We didn't have it. We were sitting ducks. I followed the chief engineer to the aft end of the engine room. We entered the small compartment that housed the emergency air compressor. It was a tight space, cluttered with boxes of spare filters and rags. The compressor was a small 2-cylinder diesel engine, painted yellow. It looked like a toy compared to the massive main engines. It had a hand crank for starting. The air in the room smelled of stale diesel and dust. The chief pointed at the handle. "Crank it," he shouted. "I will decompress the cylinders." I grabbed the steel crank handle. It was cold and greasy. I slid it onto the flywheel shaft. I planted my feet wide on the steel deck to get leverage. The chief held the decompression levers open to make it easier to turn. I started to spin the handle, round and round. The resistance was heavy. My shoulder muscles burned immediately. I spun it faster, trying to build momentum. The only sound was the whoosh whoosh of air pumping through the open valves and the heavy breathing of 2 men. "Now!" the chief yelled, and he slammed the decompression levers shut. The engine caught the compression. The handle kicked back violently against my palm. I almost broke my wrist. The engine coughed once, blew a puff of white smoke, and died. "Again!" the chief barked. He didn't ask if I was hurt. There was no time. I rubbed my stinging palm against my trousers and grabbed the handle again. The ship gave a shudder. We were dragging along the riverbed. The vibration came up through the soles of my boots. It felt like the ship was grinding its bones on the mud. I cranked harder this time. My boiler suit was sticking to my back with sweat. I spun the flywheel until it was a blur. The chief dropped the levers. Bang, bang, bang. The little diesel roared to life. The noise in the small room was deafening. It rattled the spare parts on the shelves. We watched the pressure gauge on the compressor outlet. The needle vibrated. It began to climb, but it was climbing so slowly. 0.5 bar. 1 bar. The chief shook his head. He put his mouth close to my ear. It's too slow. The volume is too small. It will take an hour to get enough air to turn the main engine. We ran back out to the main engine room. The bridge was calling again. I could see the light flashing on the phone panel. The chief ignored it. He ran to the generator platform. We had 3 auxiliary generators running to keep the lights on. Each generator had its own small air bottle for starting. These bottles were full, sitting at 30 bar. The chief looked at the bottles, then at the main air line. We have to transfer the air, he said. We have to rob the generators. This was a critical moment. On a ship, the auxiliary generators are your life support. They provide power for the steering gear pumps, the cooling water pumps, the lights, and the radar. If the generators stop, the ship goes blackout. You have no steering, no light, no power. You are blind and helpless. To take the air from the generator bottles is a huge risk. If a generator trips or stops for any reason, you have no air left to restart it. You guarantee a permanent blackout. The chief stood there with his hand on the valve of the number 1 generator air bottle. He looked at the pressure gauge. He looked at the darkness of the river water swirling in the sea chest filters nearby. He had to make a choice. Do we sit safe with power but no propulsion, drifting into disaster? Or do we risk everything, total power loss, for one chance to start the main engine? It was a terrible choice. If you were in charge, knowing the ship was drifting toward a line of barges, would you risk the blackout? The chief made his decision. Get the hose, he shouted. We had a high-pressure rubber hose for air tools. I grabbed it from the rack. It was covered in grime and stiff from age. We connected one end to the test cock of the generator air bottle. We connected the other end to the drain valve of the main air reservoir. The connections were not perfect. The thread sizes were slightly different. I had to force the brass coupling with a pipe wrench. The metal squeaked in protest. I tightened it until my knuckles turned white. "Open it!" I yelled. The chief cracked the valve. The hose stiffened like a snake. Air hissed angrily from the connection, but most of it went into the main tank. We watched the main pressure gauge on the control console. 4 bar, 5 bar, 6 bar. It was working. We were draining the life out of the generator safety system, but the main tank was filling. 8 bar, 9 bar. "That's enough," the chief shouted. "Close it. We need to save a little for the Geans." We had 9 bar. It was low, very low. But on a warm engine, it might be just enough to get the piston over top dead center. The chief ran to the control stand. He grabbed the telegraph and rang full astern to acknowledge the bridge order. The bells clanged sharply. "Get ready," so he told me. "Watch the tachometer." He pushed the starting lever forward. Hiss. The air rushed into the cylinders. The huge engine groaned. The flywheel began to turn. 1 revolution. 2 revolutions. I held my breath. I was praying for the firing speed of 15 RPM. The needle hit 10 RPM. Then it hesitated. The ship was still dragging in the mud. The propeller was fighting the resistance of the silt. The engine needed more power to turn than usual, but we had less air than usual. Chug, chug. The engine slowed down. The air pressure dropped instantly from 9 bar to 4 bar. The momentum was lost. The engine stopped dead. It never fired on fuel. The silence that followed was heavier than before. The hiss of the escaping air faded away. We had failed. Damn it! The chief slammed his fist on the steel console. We had used the generator air. We had used the main air. We were back to 0. The little emergency compressor was still popping away in the back room, but it was useless for this kind of immediate demand. Suddenly, the ship rolled violently to starboard. Metal shrieked against metal outside the hull. We had hit something hard, maybe a barge, maybe a piling. The engine room lights flickered as the shock dragged the generator frequency down, then they stabilized. The phone rang again. This time the captain's voice came over the loudspeaker, cracking with panic. "Engine room, we are drifting down on the Poydras Wharf. Impact in 2 minutes. Give me anything. Give me backwards, forwards, anything." The chief looked wild. He looked around the engine room, searching for a miracle. There was no compressed air left on the ship. We couldn't start the engine. Then his eyes locked on the fire station near the workshop. He wasn't looking at the fire hose. He was looking at the large red cylinders clamped to the bulkhead. "The oxyacetylene?" I asked, terrified. He was looking at the welding gear. "No," he said, his voice raspy. "Nitrogen. No. CO₂. He turned to me. The fixed firefighting system, the CO₂ room. Chief, that's liquid gas, I said. It will freeze the lines. It will shatter the steel. We don't have a choice, he said. He grabbed a heavy adjustable wrench and a coil of copper tubing from the workbench. Get the flaring tool. Get the warmth-resistant gloves. Run. We had 2 minutes before the ship crashed into a concrete wharf. We were going to try to inject liquid carbon dioxide at 50 bar pressure and minus 70 degrees temperature directly into the main engine air system. It was something that was never in the manual. It was dangerous. It could blow the manifold apart. Move, he screamed. I grabbed the flaring toolkit. It was a small red metal box. It felt light in my hand, but I knew the task ahead was heavy. We sprinted out of the engine room, up the companionway stairs toward the CO₂ bottle room on the main deck. We burst into the CO₂ room. It was cool and quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos below. Rows of tall red steel cylinders stood clamped in racks like silent soldiers. We didn't touch the big main bank cylinders. They were piped directly to the cargo holds and engine room nozzles. We needed the pilot bottles. These were smaller portable cylinders used to pneumatically trigger the main system. The chief pointed to a spare pilot bottle clamped to the bulkhead near the door. That one, grab it. I undid the steel toggle clamp. It snapped open with a loud clack. I bear hugged the cylinder. It weighed about 30 kilograms. It was cold, smooth painted steel. I lifted it off the rack. My lower back strained against the weight. I stumbled backward, my boots slipping on the painted deck. Go, go, the chief yelled. He was already stripping the protective cap off the valve threads. We ran back out onto the grating. We didn't go all the way down to the bottom plates. We stopped at the middle platform where the main starting air pipe ran toward the cylinder heads. There was a small test valve there used for attaching pressure gauges. I slammed the heavy bottle down on the steel grating. It rang like a bell. The vibration of the ship was getting worse. A low grinding sound was coming through the hull. We were scraping the riverbank. The chief fell to his knees. He took the coil of copper tubing. He didn't measure it. He just bent it over his knee to get the rough shape. The copper was soft, but he kinked it slightly in his haste. Hold the bottle steady, he shouted. I gripped the red cylinder with both hands to keep it from rolling on the vibrating deck. The chief inserted one end of the copper tube into the bottle's outlet. He grabbed the flaring tool. He clamped it onto the tube end and spun the screw. The metal squeaked as it was forced into a cone shape. He did it in 5 seconds. It usually takes a minute. He jammed the flared end into the bottle connection and tightened the nut with his wrench. He moved to the other end. He connected it to the test valve on the main air pipe. The threads were not a perfect match. He forced it. I saw brass shavings curl off the nut as he cross-threaded it into place. He didn't care. It just to hold for 10 seconds. This is going to get cold, he warned. Don't let go. We were bypassing the safety interlocks. We were bypassing the receiver. We were injecting liquid CO₂ directly into the starting manifold. Open it. I reached over and twisted the valve wheel on the top of the CO₂ bottle. It was stiff. I wrenched it hard. Hiss, crack. The sound was like a whip cracking. The copper tube instantly turned white. A thick layer of frost formed on the metal in less than a second. The air around the connection turned into a white fog. The cold was intense. I could feel it radiating through the soles of my boots. The copper tube began to vibrate violently. It was carrying liquid gas at 50 bar pressure. As the liquid hit the warmer steel of the main pipe, it flashed into gas, expanding hundreds of times in volume. The pipe groaned. It's holding, the chief screamed. The pressure gauge on the local board jumped from 0 to 30 bar in a blink. It pegged the needle against the stop. The chief didn't wait. He didn't check the temperature. He reached for the local control lever on the engine side. This was the emergency maneuvering stand. He grabbed the lever. He looked at me. His eyes were wide. Pray for the piston rings, he said. He shoved the lever to start. There was no wheezing sound this time. There was a violent thud. The CO₂ hit the pistons like a sledgehammer. The engine didn't just turn, it jumped. The cylinder relief valves screamed as the pressure spiked. The whole engine block rocked on its foundation. Bam! Bam! The flywheel spun. It was ugly and rough, but it was fast. The tachometer shot up to 30 RPM immediately. The chief slammed the fuel lever to full. The fuel pumps injected diesel into the cylinders. The mixture met the compression. Boom. Cylinder number 1 fired. A plume of black smoke erupted from a leaking flange on the exhaust manifold. Then number 2 fired. Then number 5. The engine roared to life. It sounded angry. The knock of the diesel ignition was hard and metallic, probably because the cylinders were supercooled by the CO₂ changing the clearances. But it was running. "We have revs," I shouted. The shaft began to turn. The ship shook violently as the propeller bit into the water. We were at full astern. The propeller was churning the mud and the water, fighting to stop our slide. For 10 seconds, nothing changed. The grinding noise on the hull continued. We were still pinned against the bank or the obstruction. Then slowly the grinding stopped. The ship shuddered and pulled free. The vibration changed from the chaotic rattle of grounding to the rhythmic throb of the propeller taking the load. We were moving backward. We were pulling away from the wharf. The phone rang. The chief picked it up. His hand was trembling so bad he almost dropped the receiver. "Engine room," he gasped. It was the captain. "We are clear. We are clear. Keep her coming astern. Don't stop." The chief hung up. He leaned back against the oily handrail and slid down until he was sitting on the deck plates. He looked at the copper tube. It was frozen solid, encased in a block of ice 3 inches thick. The CO₂ bottle was empty, its sides covered in white rime. We had saved the ship. We kept the engine running astern for another 5 minutes until the tugboats arrived to secure us. We didn't dare stop the engine. We knew we had no air to restart it if we stopped. Later, when we finally anchored in a safe area, we inspected the damage. The copper tube had shattered like glass when we tried to remove it. The extreme cold of the CO₂ had made the metal brittle. If we had run it for 10 seconds longer, that tube would have exploded, and the gas would have suffocated us right there on the platform. We also found that the thermal shock had cracked the liner on cylinder number 4. The sudden change from hot engine to freezing gas was too much for the cast iron. But a cracked liner is cheap compared to a collision with a wharf or sinking a barge. The pilot came down to the engine room before he left. He was an old man chewing on a cigar. He looked at the frost that was still melting on the pipework. "I've been on this river 40 years, he said. "I've never seen a ship dead in the water come back to life like that. What did you do?" The chief just smiled, a tired, weary smile. He pointed to the empty red bottle lying on the deck. "We gave her a cold drink," he said. "We spent the next 12 hours overhauling the starting air distributor and changing the cracked liner. It was hard, hot work, but nobody complained. We were alive. We still had jobs. That incident taught me that the manual is written for when things go right. When things go wrong, you have to know the physics of your machinery. You have to know what is possible, not just what is allowed. We used a firefighting gas to start a diesel engine. It shouldn't have worked. It should have destroyed the manifold, but it gave us the one kick we needed. Have you ever had to use a tool for something it was completely not designed for to save the day? A wrench as a hammer? A fire hose as a belt? Tell me your MacGyver stories in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, hit that like button. Stay safe and watch your gauges.